Hey, government students. I just wanted to give you guys a quick rundown on the last step to criminal due process. And as you can see here, the last stage of the criminal due process are the rights and freedoms you're guaranteed after you have been convicted of a crime. So the punishment phase. So what freedoms do you have? Well, these specifically come from the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment says that you are free from excessive fines imposed, as in something that a fine that outweighs the crime that you are convicted of. In addition to the stipulation that the punishment handed down cannot be cruel and unusual. Um, Obviously, this is subjective, and it varies based on the circumstances. But it usually comes up in the manner of the death penalty. So the death penalty, which is longstanding tradition, in many cultures around the world, as a punishment for various crimes, usually ones that deal with murder. All right, but then there's obviously different exceptions out there to the death penalty, and so we're going to take a look at that as the focus for the Eighth Amendment. All right, so as we've been doing in the past, I try to give you guys a scenario and see whether or not the Eighth Amendment in this particular situation applies, and if this situation, by receiving the death penalty, would be considered cruel and unusual. So here's the scenario: Milton was a young man with a severe mental handicap. He continued to get frustrated with his boss at work for stealing his stapler. It was a swing line. So, in a fit of rage, Milton burned down the company headquarters and blew up his boss's car. Milton was found guilty by a jury, and the judge in the case sentenced Milton to death. Milton's lawyers claim that in his case, the death penalty violates the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. All right, so take a minute and decide for yourself, pause the video if you'd like, whether or not this is cruel and unusual. All right. So most likely you came to the conclusion that it would be considered cruel and unusual. All right, so for various reasons. One, the fact that Milton was severely handicapped calls into question the ability for him to understand the severity of his crime. And while it doesn't excuse him from punishment, usually the state takes the death penalty off the table for those that are deemed, below a certain mental capacity. And that again varies from state to state, but basically, lower IQs and mental functioning would take the death penalty off the table. Additionally, nobody was actually killed in this scenario. While there is large destruction of property, usually the death penalty is reserved for cases that involve, the most heinous of crimes, including, murder, and not just all murders as well. Ones that are usually premeditated in nature, and not in, a fit of rage, which would be a lesser degree of murder, right? Where people act on their emotions rather than thought out, long planned actions. And also, too, the judge is the one that handed down the punishment of the death penalty, whereas the Supreme Court has ruled that a separate trial, specifically for whether or not the person convicted of murder in a death penalty case should receive the death penalty or not, must occur. So it cannot be handed down by a judge. The death penalty specifically must be ruled upon by a jury of your peers. And again, it's a separate case from the actual trial. So essentially, you have a trial and decide whether or not somebody is guilty of murder in the first degree or not. Additionally, the death penalty could be on the table depending on the court. And if the death penalty is on the table, they have to have a separate trial to deem whether or not that person is to receive the death penalty as a punishment or receive some other form of punishment in its place. All right, so here are the basic rules to the death penalty, and we mentioned some of them already. The death penalty is a good example of federalism because the death penalty exists in many states, as well as it is banned in many states. And it's up to each state to determine whether or not they institute the death penalty as part of a punishment in that state. Additionally, the federal government has ruled that the death penalty is a possibility in federal crimes. However, it has gone recently back and forth as to whether or not they actually hand out death penalties in the federal government level. And a lot of times it depends on the administration that's in office and the way the Justice Department carries out the actions for those crimes. Additionally, as far as limits to the death penalty, its applications have to be non-arbitrary, as in they have to be for specific crimes, like I mentioned earlier, usually first-degree premeditated murder or similar crimes. And it cannot be deemed mandatory, right? It cannot be a guaranteed, if you're guilty of first-degree murder, you're guaranteed the death penalty. That is, deemed cruel and unusual because it doesn't take into account the circumstances. So typically how they end up handling these depends upon, again, who the defendant is, whether it's that mental handicap that we mentioned earlier, or other things that are taken into consideration is the age of the defendant. So a minor cannot receive the death penalty. And additionally, those that are deemed to have a mental illness can plead insanity as the defense and would be exempt from the death penalty. Doesn't mean they're exempt from being tried in court. It just means the death penalty specifically is off the table. And then finally, like I mentioned earlier, the jury has to be the one to decide whether or not someone receives the death penalty, not the actual judge. And that comes to a decision in a separate trial. All right, and then finally, just to show you what the death penalty looks like around the country, most states, as in the ones in red, do have the death penalty in place. However, I will note that just a couple of weeks ago, and is not included in this graphic, Virginia became the first state in the South to ban the death penalty. And additionally, there have been talks in many states of getting rid of the death penalty, as well as the death penalty being on the books in many of those red states, but not actually used in application. And so for that reason, it's a little misleading into how many states actually utilize the death penalty, but the ones in red essentially are the ones that have it on the books still, minus Virginia that I gave you the example of. All right, so that should round out the death penalty and cruel and unusual. Essentially, in general, the death penalty is deemed by the Supreme Court as not cruel and unusual, but they have set exceptions to it that I mentioned earlier.